Hi everyone, welcome to week 4 of Intro to Folk Studies. Hope you're all doing well. I enjoyed receiving emails from lots of you over this past week regarding your project ideas. There are lots of interesting thoughts going around out there, and I look forward to learning more about many of the groups that you all are thinking about working with. Once you've heard back from me, or if you have a solid idea that you're ready to proceed with about which group you plan to work with, the next step is going to be to look back carefully over the instructions for the project, so make sure you review those requirements before you get started with your fieldwork, because they will lay out for you some of the specifics of what you should be observing and what you should be asking about in your interview. If you have questions as you start this stage, or once you've conducted your fieldwork, if you have questions about kind of coming up with what to write about, please remember that Chloe and I are here to help, so sometimes just a quick conversation can really help kind of get the ideas going. You can do that with us in office hours or via email if you're not close to campus. So keep in touch as you're working on that. If you come across any obstacles, we're happy to kind of help you move things along. Regarding the last week's discussion board posts, a couple kind of general thoughts and feedback and in response to what you all posted. For the most part, really nice job this week making connections between the major kind of characteristics of the three genres of folk narrative, myth, legend, and folktale, and those examples that you were reading of those three genres. So you guys did a nice job applying the characteristics of myth to the Yuki and Cherokee creation stories, characteristics of folktale to the Maiden, the Frog, and the Chief's Son, and the characteristics of legend to the Kentucky Fried Rat stories. So I hope you all enjoyed reading those narratives. It seemed like folks were feeling pretty comfortable in terms of distinguishing between those genres and talking about them. If you are still a little bit confused or find yourself just needing a refresher at some point, remember there's a chart that compares those key characteristics in terms of character, setting, belief, and so forth in the PowerPoint on legends from last week. So that's a good place to go for kind of a quick review. Many of you posed questions in your discussion board posts about kind of wondering why there were such similar versions of a story in different cultures. So for example, the African and European versions of what we know as Cinderella story. And there are a couple different theories that scholars have proposed to explain those kinds of similarities. This is just kind of answering your question. It's not something you need to memorize, but one theory is diffusion, the idea of cultural diffusion. So the thought behind that is that a story originates in a particular place, and then it spreads as people move from place to place, or just between storytellers. So one person tells a story, another person tells a story, and kind of gradually over time, that story moves to a new place, a new part of the world. So that's the idea of cultural diffusion. The other kind of competing theory is the theory of what's called polygenesis, which is essentially that all of these very similar stories occurred simultaneously, independent of one another, in different parts of the world. So, rather than saying there was one original story and it moved, they're saying they all kind of happened at the same time. And now, many scholars kind of feel that it's probably something in between those two that actually happened. So some people, for example, make the case that similar motifs, right? Those small recurring pieces of a folktale, for example, perhaps can occur spontaneously and be very similar in different cultures. But that when you see an entire tale, a tale type, as folklorists call it, right? The kind of story in its entirety, when you see that happening so similarly in different parts of the world, that it's more likely due to this kind of processes of migration and trade and all these ways in which culture moves between groups. So again, just to kind of address that question that came up in your discussion, it's an interesting question, and I know one that is kind of fun to think about. How do we, in such seemingly different cultures and such seemingly different parts of the world, end up telling the same stories, basically. It's kind of cool, I think, to think about that as well. So for this week, we're moving into another major genre of folklore. So last week we were looking at verbal lore. This week we're looking at material culture. So whereas last week we were talking about things that people say, this week we're talking about things that people make, right? So we'll talk about folk art, we'll talk about food. You're going to start with some, again, a kind of general reading by Henry Glassy and some general explanations in the first PowerPoint as well, about what material culture is, introducing the term folk art. And that term refers to, much like folk narrative, doesn't refer to a particular style of narrative. Folk art isn't describing like the way a particular kind of art looks. It's more describing the way it's learned, the way it's shared between people, and you'll learn more about this in your lectures and readings for this week. Then you'll get into some specific examples, looking at, for instance, an example of folk art from a maximum security prison in Louisiana, looking at one of the perhaps most fun and kind of familiar examples of material culture in foodways, talking about food and traditions surrounding it. Again, some examples illustrating what material culture is and how it can be understood in the same terms that we understand other kinds of folklore. So you also have your fourth quiz and discussion board post this week. Quiz 4 will be up later today. I don't think it's actually available yet on Blackboard, but it will be by the end of today for you all. I know some folks like to get to it early. So make sure that's available. And just a little bit of a motivational reminder here that a few of you who have been consistently completing the assignments sort of dropped off the radar this week and missed a discussion board post or missed a quiz. Remember, we're already halfway through the term, so stick with it, hang in there. Make sure you get your assignments completed this week so that you're not dropping behind as we're at this halfway point, okay? So again, just going back to my point at the beginning, as you're starting to work on your field work for your projects, as you're starting to think about conducting those observations and interviews, or perhaps already doing them, and just make sure that you're focusing on what is the shared culture of this group that you are learning about. What are their traditions? How can you see them doing the kinds of things that we are reading and learning about? And what seems important to them as a group, right? So those are the kinds of things that you should be focusing on, starting to think about, writing about when you move into the later steps of the process, okay? And as I said, feel free to kind of reach out for help at any point in that process, okay? So I hope you all have a good week, and look forward to hearing from you through Blackboard and your emails in the coming days. Thanks.